I work with the Ashoka Trust for Research in Ecology and Environment, and I head the Center for Policy Design. So today I will be talking a little bit about One Health. I'm sure you've heard the term already and have already also heard of the definition of One Health. What is One Health? This is generally the kind of figure you might see when you hear the term One Health, and it comes with the tagline for One Health is healthy people, healthy animals, healthy environment, that they're all interlinked. But more broadly, it's a nice sounding idea that yes, everything's interconnected, but that's what we've been, it's not just for health, everything else is also interconnected. We do live in a closed system. Planet Earth is a closed system, and obviously everything that we do within this closed system affects everything else. But One Health also should be looked at as a discipline of science. And like most other disciplines of science, or at least most other human-facing disciplines of science, should be collaborative for their true potential to be reached. So it is a collaborative, multi-sectoral, transdisciplinary approach. And it works at multiple levels for it to be most effective. Local, regional, national, and so on and so forth. And the goal is to achieve optimal health outcomes. Optimal health outcomes along, again, multiple axes, because health itself is not just along one dimension. Health is, has several different dimensions as well. So you can have nutritional health, mental health, being free from disease, and so on and so forth. But it recognizes that achieving some optimal health outcome recognizes the interconnection between people, animals, plants, and their shared environment. So this, in the last few years, especially since the COVID-19 pandemic, the idea of One Health itself has gained a lot of popularity because people suddenly became aware that diseases such as COVID-19 are zoonotic in nature, and if it's zoonotic, which means that it transfers from animals to people, then you also need to be studying animals. So it's not just the veterinarians or the animal ecologists who need to be studying animals, but also human health practitioners or public health people need to be studying animals. And so that's where the idea, the concept of One Health started getting a lot more attention, a lot more popularity. So I'll work through three broad principles. So suddenly there's lots of water. Thank you. So the concept of One Health and how it applies, especially to zoonosis, started gaining popularity. And I'm given that this course has been running for a week already, I'm sure you'll have heard of some of this, but I'm going to repeat it nonetheless. So terms such as spillover, zoonotic spillover, these are, I'm sure you're familiar with some of these now. People must have talked about it. I've seen a couple of slides that I've looked at, showed you how transmission patterns work, how most emerging infectious diseases come from animals, about 70% come from animals, and so on and so forth. So you're familiar with some of these basic topics now. But let's recap some of this, especially with this kind of framing. So when we talk about cross-species transmission or zoonotic spillover, what are some things to keep in mind? One, what is the process that it leads to? This is more or less what the world looks like currently. There are some areas of, shall we say, naturalness. Okay, there is an in-between interface where there's some levels of human activity, usually agricultural human activity, and then you have urban areas where you have very high levels of human activity. And this is a continuum across most of the world. In India, of course, there are very sharp boundaries between these interfaces. Many other places, these interfaces are meld into one another, for instance. And typically, your natural areas will have some wildlife populations. Okay, I'm using bats as an example. In fact, I'll use bats quite a bit in the first half of this, and then we'll move to other species. But usually, your natural areas will have some populations of bats. In India, of course, and many other places in the world, your human use areas also have lots of populations of bats. But we'll come to that and what that problem is. And within that bat population, you'll have some circulating pathogens. Those pathogens may or may not cause diseases in the bats. Okay, because pathogens are also part of your living environment. And you have humans around them, you have your domestic animals around them, you have people moving from here to there and there to here. Okay, so there are natural cycles of infection that are going on in your wild animal populations. And as these infections happen, they also tend to shed pathogens. They could be viruses, they could be bacteria, they could be something else. Okay, so they tend to shed. And it's this interface here where you often see potential for spillover from one to the other. Okay. So it could either happen directly or it could happen via a bridging host. So it could happen either direct transmission from wild animal to human, if there has been contact or if there's been susceptible or there's some susceptibility in the population. You will see this direct thing happening, or as it often happens, it will be via a bridging host, your domestic animals. It could be through pigs, it could be through cattle, it could be through dogs, it could be through something else, even rodents and so on, which sort of have now become commensal with humans and are as much part of our lives as any other animal. Okay. And then there's so you have the infect, shed, and then the spill has happened. Okay. And then once it moves to the human-dominated landscape, and once this cycle then separates from that, okay, where human-to-human transmission exceeds your animal-to-human transmission, or now human-to-human transmission becomes the main mode of humans getting the disease, then that's when it starts becoming this rapidly spreading like COVID-19. Okay, it happened, we assume the spillover happened a couple of times, but once it happened, then those animals were no longer involved in the process of spillover. Okay, because then the human-to-human transmission itself took over and it ran like wildfire. And it could have remained localized. It could have remained localized, it could have remained within China, it could have remained, so for example with SARS-1, it could have remained within Southeast Asia. MERS, it could have remained in Middle East. But it's our globalized lifestyles, our rapid jet setting around the world that quickly took a localized disease and made it a pandemic. Okay, so beyond this first bit, this part played no part in the spread of that disease. It only required that first spillover. And there are spillovers happening all the time. Okay? So let's talk about a little bit about the mechanism of why spillovers can happen. Or why animals can get infected, why they can become, why they can become, I don't want to use the word dangerous, but why the potential for spillover increases in some cases. So let's examine, again, I'll use bats, like I said, I'm using bats. And bats are an interesting sort of organism because, of course, they're the only flying mammal. They have very high energy needs. Okay, so let's assume there's a bat, which has some energy need for its normal existence. Okay, and that's the total amount of energy available to it through its daily intake of food and so on. Okay. And that's what it then uses for its energetically expensive activities. So what is an energetically expensive activity? Anytime an animal is not resting and is then indulging in some other activity which requires it to move a lot or expend a lot of energy, that becomes an energetically expensive activity. Okay? In the case of bats in particular, they fly. Flying is very energetically expensive for bats. Okay? And I'm sure you've seen fruit bats, you know, the big flying foxes that you see around here, or any other species of fruit bat, or even insectivorous bat. They spend a lot of their time flying around. And so they're using up a lot of energy. And they're also small. Okay? So if you think of it, their body size to surface area ratio is large. So therefore, there's a lot of heat is coming out of them. So they require a lot of food. So their, the energy available to them needs to be fairly high. So just for their normal daily existence and their energetically expensive activities. But what happens, so that together becomes the total energy needed, okay? And then there's a small buffer. So that buffer is available to them in case there's some stressful event that happens, where they have to then expend more energy. There's a little bit of a buffer available, okay? But it also depends when that stressful event can occur. Okay, it could occur at a lower time of energy use, it could occur at a higher time of energy use. But if it occurs and it pushes up your expenditure of energy, usually the increase in your energetically expensive energy consumption will be a lot higher and probably take up all of that buffer you had in terms of the energy available to you in the environment. Okay, but it's still fine. Things are still, this happens all the time with animals. Okay, suddenly, you know, some fruit tree that they would normally have gone to was not fruiting that year, or it was cut down, or it fell down in a storm. Any sort of natural events could occur that would cause this scenario. But bring in human activity, land use change. We are now changing things far too rapidly. Okay, so once you bring human activity in, we actually tend to reduce that buffer. Okay, we tend to remove that buffer, and because we have removed that buffer, now your total energy needed, okay, has disappeared. You're in your energetically expensive mode, but you don't know where to get that energy from. Okay, and that leads to stress, and leads to chronic stress. And as I'm sure many of you know, what does stress do? Any ideas? What does stress do? You should not answer. It actually lowers your immunity response. It makes you immunocompromised, as Arun was saying. Okay? So, what does that do then? If it makes you immunocompromised, remember all those pathogens that are circling around inside you, which were not causing you any disease as yet. You were sort of battling them off. You know, all the time we are battling off pathogens. Every second. We are breathing in pathogens, we are breathing in bacteria, viruses, and so on. We're not falling sick constantly. Our immune system is working, as is theirs. And because bats have this heightened energy demand, they really actually have a lot of, for whatever reason, evolutionarily, they host a huge variety of different viruses and other pathogens. Okay, so they are like, they are an important sort of reservoir for a lot of different diseases. But once you get chronic stress in the system, then they start getting sick as well. And if they start getting sick, that's when they start shedding and infecting and becoming more and more, or getting others sick as well. So then the process of spread of pathogens, especially pathogenic, highly pathogenic ones, starts. Okay, and if in the case of viruses can evolve fast. Once they start having lots of hosts to infect, then mutation happens, the rates of mutation happen. You can then get the potential for viruses that can also infect other species. Because you're now not just circulating within one population, you're also circulating between different populations of that same species. And then the viruses are being shed are also then interacting with a whole different host of species. Okay, you just have more of it out there in the environment. So this is when you have this problem. But things are still not so bad, okay? Because if you looked at what would happen normally, okay? So imagine you have a reservoir host population in your forest, and they had this viral infection and shedding and so on going on. But you're still in a forest, you don't have your domestic animals there. So there was no chance of a spillover. The moment you start clearing forests and people start moving in there, or livestock start moving in there, you start either increasing the size of the hole. So you know, 2 or 3 things can happen. You can, you have a land use, you have your animals itself moving to different places or being forced out of their habitats. Yeah. You can speak, or it's recorded. Okay. Yeah.
So would it be okay to assume that, so since with land use change and fruiting trees being lost, fruit-eating bats or the pteropodids would be much in stress than the carnivorous bats and would shed more pathogen?
Yes and no. In many places, yeah. So pteropodid bats or old world fruit bats are particularly susceptible. And also if you looked at, so for example, a lot of the coronaviruses are in fruit bats. But there are other, even the insectivorous bats can be, because the same processes can lead to a depletion in insect populations around natural areas. Okay, especially when we convert them to agricultural areas, and then now agricultural areas normally would be great for insect pests, which is what happens, right? But then what do we do to control those insect pests? Yeah, we want to remove them, we want to reduce them. So which areas have what kinds of pests really depends on that land use. I mean, what kind of insects or what kind of resource depends on the land use practice there. Okay. So yeah, so what happens then is basically you could have a land use. So this process of land use induced spillover involves a movement of the host species itself to areas where they're more likely to encounter humans. And the potential for more animals to be shedding because of that stress, what's called the allostatic stress. Okay, it's the process I spoke about earlier is called allostatic overload. Okay, where your basically your energy demand exceeds your peak energy available. Okay, so the animals are now in allostatic overload. So which means more animals are infected, more animals are shedding. And now because of human-induced changes, you also have people, livestock, etc. in the same space. So those are now being showered with more pathogens that they previously had not encountered or likely had not encountered. Because this is also important to understand. All of us have immunity to most of the stuff or are developing immunity, or our immune system can think about fighting stuff that we've encountered before. But when we encounter new pathogens, it takes time for our body to learn how to fight them. Sometimes it doesn't. And there are many pathogens that we have no immune defenses against. Okay, so these are all immunosusceptible individuals. These are susceptible animals. They have no prior history of having encountered these pathogens because they were not in contact with the hosts that had these pathogens. Okay, so then your chance of spillover increases because you've created these conditions. You've sort of lined up all these holes through which your viral rain can come down. This last part I'll talk about later. The world, unfortunately, again, is not even or not equal when it comes to where these risks are high. You have talked about this? Okay, great. As I'm sure people have already told you, India, southern China, parts of the tropical areas are hotspots for the emergence of these. But what I want to highlight here is that, and particularly in the Indian context, and now I'm going to switch a little bit to talking about some of our own work, talking about the work that we are doing here in India. And in the Indian context, we are at a saturated interface between people, livestock, and we are also in biodiversity hotspots. So our interaction with or between these is very high all the time. Okay? And the other thing is, some of those land use induced changes that I talked about earlier, they have been going on in India for thousands of years. People are not separate from some of these landscapes. People have been accessing natural areas for livelihood benefits for centuries. Yes, we've got land use induced changes happening, and those are exacerbating some of the problems that we have, okay, and making new populations vulnerable to some of the diseases that we see around us. But how do we, what can we do to now understand the patterns of disease emergence in India, given all of these challenges that we face? This is some of the work coming from Uma's lab. They looked at, for example, bat hunting communities in Nagaland. And these communities traditionally go out and harvest bats. And these are insectivorous bats. Have you spoken about this? You have. Okay, great. Again, these communities are now coming directly in contact with bats. And there is some evidence that they may already, the antibodies to the same kinds of viruses that the bats have been found in the human population. Okay. So, like I said, people are not novel to these ecosystems. They're not novel to these interactions. In India, people have been interacting with different kinds of wildlife for a long period of time. And you can see this. In fact, the more we look, I'm sure the more we'll find also in many indigenous communities across India. But things are not the same. Things are changing rapidly in India across all of our interfaces. New people are coming in. We are making new roads. We're cutting down the last of our forests. New technologies coming in. Human populations exploded, so on and so forth. Okay. But people also benefit from bats. So this is work done by a former PhD student at ATRI, Kadambari Deshpande. Basically, these are cashew nuts. People have interactions with bats in various ways. Okay, and I want to look at the top half. The top half is cashew nuts and areca nut. Okay, the bottom is bananas. So, when you see this happening, what do you think? Is this a good thing or a bad thing? Any takers? Good thing, bad thing, neutral? Huh? Okay, so bats have good, there are ecosystem services from bats. Fruit bats or a lot of bats pollinate, so you can get some benefits from them. But in this particular case, what do you see? So you've seen some bat-eaten fruits here. If fruits are eaten by bats, does it increase their value or does it decrease their value? It decreases them. So you think this is a positive interaction between humans and bats, or is it a negative interaction? It's a negative interaction. But it's not as simple as that. Definitely with bananas, you wouldn't want to eat a bat-eaten banana, and please don't. Okay? Or any other kind of fruit that's been chewed on by any other wild animal. But in the top two, You see, we are not interested in the fruit, at least if unless you're in Goa and you want to make feni with it. Okay, you're not interested in the endocarp. You're interested in the cashew part of it. Similarly, with areca nut, the husky part is of no interest to the farmers. Instead, what bats do is bats tend to provide an interesting service to the farmers. So you've seen have you seen fruit bats foraging? What do they do? Have anybody seen? Have you observed? No? Have you seen sometimes, like, bats come into old buildings or even in your apartment buildings, you'll see streaks of bat poop everywhere. Why does that happen? There's no fruit trees inside your apartment. What they do is they go pick up the fruit, they fly away, they sit somewhere. By the way, fruit bats don't eat fruit. Did you know that? They don't eat fruit. They chew the pulp, they drink the juices, and then they excrete the rest of it. Okay? So what happens is you'll have a pile of chewed up pulp and the rest of that fruit where the bat has taken it to eat. And they're very, there's high site fidelity. It means they're loyal to that spot. So a bat will go, pick up a fruit and come back, eat it, drop it, go back again, pick up another one, come back. Okay? And because they want the ripest fruits, so when it comes to both areca nut and cashew nut, they'll go and pick the ripest fruits from the tree. Okay? And they'll bring it back. And so for the farmers, it's great. They don't have to deploy labor to go and pick up the fruits from the trees. They'll just go find the bat roost, collect all the fruits. So, yeah.
I think it's not relevant, but so there is a practices in the villages that a fruit eaten, a bird or a parrot eaten Goa is much more sweeter than the natural ripened, and such kind of things do exist, right? So how it is related to this? What? So, how it is related to? Is it related to actually the spreading of the diseases?
Okay. We'll come to that. And that's an interesting question. Don't forget it. Okay, and hopefully I won't forget it. But yes, so fine. So let's just finish the story and then I'll come to that. So it's a complicated figure, but let's walk through it. Okay, so there's a process I told you about where the bat comes, it picks up its fruit, goes somewhere, sits there, chews up on it. The people then are able to collect it easily, and so on and so forth. Okay, so there's a service. There's an ecosystem service being provided by the fruit bats. They're solving a labor problem for the farmers. On the other hand, it could also be a negative for them, because for a farmer, that farmer doesn't know whether this fruit bat is going somebody else's field and dropping or somebody else is benefiting from that farmer's crop. Okay, so it's a bit of both. Okay, so there are benefits to non-planters as well. People who don't have cashew nut orchards or areca nut orchards, they also get some supply of it, but it's not such a huge amount for, I'm sure, the areca nut farmers to mine. But there is a value that people have assigned to this service that's provided by bats for free. People value it. Okay, people say, yes, this is a good thing. We don't want to see bats disappear from our environments because they provide us the service. Now, if you go back to the previous thing where I talked about, that those nice diagrams of, that's from Australia. And I worked with a couple of, or with a whole international team of scientists, and we, published that paper. But I also snuck this into that paper because that was mainly from a Western perspective, where people and animals are generally kept separate. We don't do that here. We can't do that here. There are risks. Livestock can feed on those bat-bitten fruits. People are now coming into contact with saliva. Okay, and I'm, Arun, when that Nipah outbreak happened in Kerala, people suspected it was through a bat-bitten fruit. Like it was in a guava. I think the zero case was in a guava orchard or something. Right? Mango. Okay. So people might assume that it's the fruit that a bat or a parakeet or whatever is eaten is the tastiest because they've already eaten them. Okay. In some cases, it hastens the ripening process, or because they only eat ripe fruit. So that's the one that you should. But what it's doing then is putting you in touch with their saliva, or putting you in contact with their saliva, and therefore increasing the chance that you would get this transmission event would happen. Okay. Similarly, animals also eating. So Nipah virus is a good example of this. Nipah virus in Southeast Asia, there are many different routes for the transmission of Nipah virus itself in different places. In Bangladesh, there's a different route. In India, there's a different route. In Southeast Asia, there's a different route. In Southeast Asia, it was through pigs, because the bats were coming up, eating the fruit and dropping it where the pig farms and the small scale pig farms. And the pigs were eating those fruits, they got the virus. Okay. And then from the pigs, it went to the human handlers. In Bangladesh, it's very interesting. Bangladesh, it's from toddy collectors. So, the toddy sap, the palm. So the bats were coming to sip on that nira that was being collected. Okay. And in Kerala, most likely it was from somebody eating a fruit that was already handled by bats previously. So it's the same virus, but the pathway of that transmission event was very different in these three places. Okay. So what does it mean for us in the Indian context to try and use this One Health approach to understand some of these zoonotic diseases, or to try and, to understand them and to mitigate them? So let me give you a couple of examples. I'm sure all of you have heard of rabies. Yeah, it's one of the deadliest known diseases with a near 100% fatality rate. So if you get rabies, there's no cure for it. Most likely, 99.99% you'll die. Okay, there are one or two or a handful of survivors following something called the Milwaukee Protocol. But in most cases, or again, like in almost all cases, you die from it. Okay, so it's a deadly disease, and India is the hotspot, global hotspot for rabies cases. The last estimate for it puts it at about 20,000 human deaths per year. This is most likely going to be revised downwards to maybe 10 to 12,000 because of better availability of vaccines or better access to vaccines and so on. It's a 100% vaccine preventable disease. Okay. Again, there have been a few cases where despite vaccination, people have gotten rabies and died, but that might be because of improper vaccination or improper protocols being followed post-bite. The number one cause of rabies, or the number one carrier of rabies in India, is dogs. Okay. In other countries, there are other species. Globally also, mostly it's domestic dogs. But say, for example, in North America, where you don't have large populations of free-ranging dogs, it might be raccoons, it might be foxes, it could be bats. Their insectivorous bats are the main carriers of rabies. Okay. And as I was just chatting to Uma and a little bit earlier, domestic cats in the US are the number one domestic animal that is a carrier of rabies. Okay. But in India, it's definitely dogs. So I was working on a research project a few years ago to try and understand rabies better in the Indian context, because there's so much. People assume they know everything about rabies. If you go to any of the rabies conference talks, it's the same stuff. Oh, yes, we know dogs are the main cause of it. But nobody, and all of the focus is on preventing rabies in humans And so they said, what is the One Health approach for reducing rabies? So WHO came out and said, you have to obviously vaccinate the dogs. If you vaccinate 70% of the dog population annually, okay, then it'll achieve something called herd immunity. Have you heard of the term herd immunity? Yeah, okay. It'll achieve something called herd immunity. Now, as it turns out, herd immunity for rabies in dogs is not 70%. It's much lower. How much do you think it is? Throw some numbers out. 40%. Good. 40%. It's between 25 to 40%. Okay, that's the herd immunity level. Yes, yet we are still targeting 70% of the population. Why is that? Why is that? Why do we need to,
Because of booster dose, lack of booster doses.
No, not really. I mean, that's also, it's a valid reason, but there's another reason. Sorry? No, no, in any area, it doesn't matter just urban areas, any area, anywhere in
Because we don't really have a population distribution of dogs in India. 70% might not be.
No, it doesn't matter. Even if you know that there's 100 dogs in your neighborhood, you have to vaccinate 70 of them. Huh? They are reservoirs, but it's mainly because of population turnover. Okay, what does population turnover mean? It means there are dogs on streets are not your nice, healthy, long-lived animals that you have as pets. Okay, they don't live up till 12 to 14 years. In the US, you have to vaccinate your dog once in 3 years. That's it. But the same vaccine in India is given every year to a dog. Okay. Might be overkill, don't know. But it's given. That's how it is. But that's also because the dogs on the streets, no matter what the animal welfare people tell you, have miserable lives. They die very young. 80% of the pups that are born will not survive till the age of 1. Okay? And most dogs, so your average lifespan on the street is about 3 to 5 years. A dog on the street typically does not live beyond 5 years. So you have a high population turnover rate. To achieve the 25 to 40% herd immunity, you need to actually therefore vaccinate at least 70% of your population to account for this turnover rate. Okay? Now, we assume that this is easy, no? We should be able to vaccinate 70%, right? How many dogs do you think there are in Bangalore? How many of you are from Bangalore? Only a few. Where are the other places you guys are from? Which cities or which urban areas? Hyderabad, Kerala, not a city. Chennai, fantastic. Chennai apparently is rabies free, don't believe them. Mumbai, okay. How many dogs do you think there are in your city? All you Bangalore people. How many dogs do you think there are in your cities? In your own street. Okay. Rough guesses. Huh? 1 per 30 people. That's the estimate that's recently come out from Livestock Census of India. It's rubbish.
It is 1 per 30 people. Now, Bangalore 70 million. 20,000 dogs, going once. More than 50,000. No one else. More than 50,000.
50,000.
50,000 has no upper limit.
I know. 6 lakhs.
6 lakhs.
All right. Yeah, we're getting somewhere close now. Good. Okay.
6 million.
Oh, that's a lot. Okay. Typically, most cities in India, and Bangalore is a big city. We have a population of more than 1 crore people now. we have probably between 6 to 8 lakh dogs. Okay. India itself has probably about 80 million free-ranging dogs. Okay. Do you think we can achieve the 70% vaccination target? It's possible. Anything is possible. I mean, you can do it. Many places they've attempted it, they've tried, they have succeeded. Huh? It's a good question. Many places they're not reaching people also. How will they reach dogs? Okay, let me take you to Pune city. Okay, so I did some work in Pune city in collaboration with this organization called Rescue. So they're an animal welfare organization. And at that time, they used to rescue animals from the streets. Okay, it could be cats, it could be dogs, it could be cows, horses, donkeys, anything. Okay, now they've mostly left that alone and they concentrate on wildlife. But they had this fantastic system that they had come up with, which was based on a reporting. So anybody could either call their hotline, or on their web, they had a web interface or an app. They could report if they saw an animal in distress anywhere. And then they had ambulances all over the city. So they could immediately dispatch an ambulance there to pick up that animal and bring it to their shelter or the hospital. Okay. And because they were doing such a good job that even the city had said, here, you handle all the cases. Okay. Because the city's system itself was not geared up for it properly. The other NGOs that were there also were not able to do it well enough. So ultimately, Rescue used to end up collecting most of the animals that needed help in some way or the other. So then, they got in touch with me because I was looking, I was like spread the word around, I was looking for collaborators. And so we started giving them test kits to test for rabies. So we started with this LFA, all of you are very familiar with these now. So when the animal died, well, before it died, we took a salivary sample, and after it died, we took a brain sample. Okay, and we tested it for rabies. The brain samples generally tend to be more confirmatory in nature. Okay, and in 2 lines, as I'm sure you've seen from COVID tests, 2 lines means positive. Okay, and because these are not gold standard tests, we also then got them tested we took those same samples, sent them to NIMHANS and to the OIE reference laboratory here at the veterinary college here to get a confirmation, okay, that whether these are matching up, whether these tests match up to that or not. And there was pretty high conformity. There was a little bit of underestimation using this method, okay. So there were some false negatives with this method also, okay, which the PCR-based method would pick up.
So you just grind up the brains and apply it there on that?
Yeah, you put it in that solution that they come up with. And although there's an amended protocol, you don't do that with the solution. Okay. Apparently, if you just grind up the brains and just put it in this, sensitivity increases. So that's now the new protocol for using these. Yeah.
They have recently revised WHO protocol for rabies. Charles Supret has revised.
So now they don't put it in the diluent anymore.
Yeah. It is recent and good methodology there.
So this was pre-pandemic, so we still that paper hadn't been published yet. So what would the results look like? I'll show you 1 year of results from Pune city, and it's only because I haven't updated this map. Each red dog is a rabies positive dog. Okay, so that then turns out, sorry, it's not in review anymore, I should change this, it's published already. But this, over those 4.5 years, 5 years, is what the map of rabid dogs in Pune city look like. Okay, basically everywhere. There was no place that was, except for some of these cantonment areas, obviously, where there's very few dogs. So there were lots of dogs in Pune city and lots of them had rabies. So everywhere you look, basically you found them. There were hotspots in time, hotspots in space. Some areas were more likely to be, to have dogs with rabies, but they were all evenly spread out in time. There was no area that, had a huge gap between them. So this study was part of a broader study that we did to look at the ecology, try and understand the ecology of dogs. Okay, because from just a perspective, from just the, just trying to understand how rabies spreads from in dog populations, it's not just dogs that are important, there are also other host species potentially there. So we did a whole bunch of studies. I won't go into the details on this, but we collared a lot of dogs also to look at their movement and try and understand how movement dynamics of dogs can help us understand potential transmission rates for rabies and what that means for even controlling rabies. Okay, I won't present the results of that, but basically what we wanted to do was try and test these kinds of models. Okay, the hypothesis that we were working with is that urban areas, and this is the opposite of what WHO and number of other studies from the world show, like from Africa and stuff. This is the opposite pattern that we were testing, because this is what we believe to be true for Indian cities. That urban areas were the source for rabies to come for rural areas. Okay, that you'd usually have lots of dogs in urban areas, between 4 to 8 lakh dogs in most cities. And via some peri-urban interface, they would come out into the rural area. Okay, if not the dog itself, then definitely rabies. And rabies in India, like with most other diseases, is a rural problem. 96% is a rural problem. 96% of rabies fatalities in India happen in rural areas. In that study in Pune city, we tested about 1,500 dogs, of which about 700 were positive. Okay? Yeah. Okay. And it was not just random, because it was purposive sampling, so it doesn't represent the entire number, all the dogs that came in, but we identified animals that showed potentially showed signs, or if over time we started ignoring signs of what was classically known as rabies. Okay, because we found animals that would not normally have been diagnosed as rabies also testing positive for rabies. Animals that people thought had head trauma or a ear infection, okay, they would bring them, keep them under observation. 2 days later, that animal would be dead. If we tested, we found it to be rabies positive. A lot of road kills or animals injured in road accidents end up being rabies. And that makes sense, because when an animal gets rabies, it becomes disoriented. It doesn't know where it's going anymore. So the likelihood that it'll get involved in an accident is also high. People were never testing these animals for rabies, right? So if we assume then that this kind of a flow is happening, okay, what does that mean for control of rabies in India? Should we target cities for control, or should we target rural areas for control? Cities, okay, interesting. So in that same time, yeah.
I just had a question.
Mike. Yes. Rules.
So you just said that so the dog density is very high in the urban areas, but the sampling which was done earlier was also in the urban areas, right? Where you have 1,000 something. Now but you're saying the rural areas, the fatality is very high. That's the model you are saying, right? I am not able to understand.
Okay, I'll explain. So, how many rabies cases in humans do you think happened in Pune city over that 5-year period? 10, 20. Okay, any other guesses? None? Okay. She's right. There were no human cases from Pune city. Why do you think that is?
Could that have played a role?
Potentially, but that's not the answer here.
So do you think there is no sylvatic cycle involved in rabies in India?
There may be a sylvatic cycle. In fact, we've been told. Sylvatic means it's occurring independent of domestic animals. It's occurring in wild animals. Okay.
Yeah.
I'm told that mongooses in Kerala there's a sylvatic cycle.
That's what
I would like to see the evidence for it properly, and that there are different strains of rabies in mongooses. So I think we need to properly investigate that. Interestingly, in the West Indies, the small Indian mongoose was introduced, and that's the main carrier of rabies in the West Indies. Okay, yeah, go ahead.
exactly. In one of the studies in Kerala, we found more cases towards Western Ghat, connecting towards Western Ghats.
Yeah.
That's highlighting there is a possibility of sylvatic cycles.
Yeah,
so not much towards Alapura, those districts which is not connecting to Western Ghats. The incidents are very low.
So, Arun, I just also, I'm questioning a little bit about incidence rates because we are not testing properly. So, Pune, until we conducted the study, they had no idea there were that many cases. They thought 10, 20 cases must be there per year, or in dogs. Okay.
But the question about why, I mean, the reason for why there's more rural fatalities is probably because all those urban guys got vaccinated.
Correct. Yeah. So that's what I'm coming to. So people in Pune city had access to vaccines easily. Okay, they didn't have to travel to the nearest public health center, which might be in the city, leave their villages, leave their work in the field, and go there. Remember, this is rural areas. This is, Kerala is an exception. Goa might be an exception. But most places in India, for somebody to go get a vaccine, requires them to leave their work, go somewhere, take a bus, go somewhere, get the vaccine, come back. Also, if you get bitten by a dog for the first time you get exposed, you also need immunoglobulin. Okay? Most places don't have immunoglobulin. Even in cities, they don't have. It's very expensive in the private center. Nobody can afford it, 40, 50,000 rupees. Okay? And then you go once, not just once, you have to then go again and again and again, complete the 5-dose cycle. It's a lot of effort. Okay? So in urban areas, people are able to get vaccines easily. There's a lot more awareness about it. In rural areas, on the other hand, there's not much awareness, or if there's awareness, there's a barrier. Okay? So coming to Farah's question then, I said that lots of dogs are in urban areas, but I said most of the cases happen in rural areas. It's a frequency thing. Okay? Because if you think about it logically, rabies is not that much of a public health concern in India. 10, 12,000 people dying of a disease per year is not that much. If you think of, in terms of all the other diseases, if you rank and, the rabies people will lynch me for saying this. It's wholly preventable and it should be eliminated. We should have 0 rabies cases in India. There's no reason for us to have rabies in India. It's fully preventable. But from the public health perspective, it's not prioritized. Okay, especially in rural areas. Once in a while, somebody gets bitten, then they may come, they may not come, they might go to the local Ved. In Solapur, there's a well, people go and drink water from there. and that's supposed to cure rabies. Somewhere else they go to, in Gujarat, we've, Collaborate and I wrote a paper about this also. They go to a certain temple and pray at the temple, and the priest ties something and says, if that Mataji is, it's a punishment from her if you don't drink and if you don't eat meat and you stay in your house for 10 days, and if you do all these things, you will not get rabies. Okay.
That is a rat tip.
That's different. Deshnok. That's Deshnok. Yeah. Arun, yes.
A couple of things actually. So as Farah told, do you think that population size would sustain continuous transmission cycles process? And plus, one more small question: why the seasonality involves in the rabies cases?
So I wish I could have shown. Maybe I'll switch to another presentation and show you some of the broader data, because I didn't. Okay, there's a couple of things. Rabies is a really strange disease. It's not your typical disease that spreads from one to the other, and you can follow that chain easily. It's not a linear spread, okay? Because rabies also has a variable incubation period. That means that if you got exposed to a dog bite today, or a dog got exposed to it, or any animal, you could either develop symptoms of rabies within a couple of weeks. It could be 6 months, it could be a year. You don't know. Till that time, you're living life normally. Okay? And you're not infectious until you get rabies. In the sense, until your symptoms develop. You're not infectious. Because rabies goes to the brain, multiplies there, okay? And then it goes to the virus, goes down to your salivary glands. So until you've developed symptoms of rabies, you're not infectious. So a dog having been bit today might not show up symptoms for rabies another 6 months later, until 6 months later. So the other thing interesting thing about rabies is not density dependent. Okay? So do you understand what density dependence means? So with any other, like for example with COVID, the more people you put together, the more possibility that virus is going to spread. So your case rates increase. Apparently rabies is not that way. Okay, at least the model suggests that. So the introduction of rabies into a population can come from just one event. So just one of these animals coming out and going there, suddenly you've got rabies in a population now, because one animal can bite 10 other animals. Okay, and then those 10 animals, some may die within a few weeks, and then rabies also has this furious form and dumb form and all sorts of various combinations within. Some animals don't develop any symptoms, they'll just quietly lie down and die. You would never know they were rabid. Some animals may develop these classic rabid, biting dog, foaming at the mouth, going and attacking anything it finds. So that's why it's difficult to understand where it comes from, when it comes from, how it comes. It just comes and goes. Okay, you can have a rabies-free population, and suddenly one immigrant or one animal comes in from somewhere, and apparently again, based on some data, rabid animals travel a lot more, especially the furious rabid ones, than your normal ranging pattern of dogs. Okay, so you could have an animal come from another village, and that's what we wanted to model. And so we've done a whole bunch more work in here, including a lot of genomic analysis also of the patterns. And we found that there is support for this hypothesis. We found these long transmission chains as well. Okay, and the point being that if you wanted to break this thing, you don't need to vaccinate 70% of the population of the city. Okay, you could try some other mechanism of vaccination, or you could say, let those dogs be in the city, let them be rabid, we don't care. Because people in cities are not dying. That's not what I'm recommending, no, not for a minute, okay? But if he said, maybe it's easier for us to control rabies in the villages. There's not as many dogs in villages as there are in cities. Most dogs tend to be owned. Okay, you might see them free ranging just as you would in a city, but they tend to be owned. They belong to somebody or the other. Okay, they have a reference person associated with them. We have a huge veterinary setup in rural areas. We have LDOs, livestock development officers. We have, so our veterinary system, animal husbandry department is actually one of the most active departments along with the agriculture department in India. So there's massive penetration of trained professionals in rural areas. They go house to house to administer vaccination to your livestock or to give some treatment. They could also be prioritized for vaccinating dogs, the owned dogs, just the owned dog population, which we again estimate to be 60-70% of the dog population in rural areas. That's it, herd immunity, right? And because they're reference animals, they can be tracked. You said last year we gave you vaccinate, this is your animal, this is Tommy, this is Sheru, this is whatever, okay? We give you a vaccination certificate, you know you've got it. You go back next year again, vaccinate again. It's possible to track them. Urban areas is a mess. Some feeder person will come, say, I vaccinated them, we have no idea. Okay. Sorry?
Which can be more like beneficial to more villages.
See, because there's always the chance of slippage is high. Okay. We want a strategy that works. And I'm not saying that we should ignore the source. I'm just saying this is the mechanism we wanted to understand from just the ecology perspective. Okay. How it can translate into overall rabies control. Currently, there is no rabies control protocol for dogs in India. None. Okay.
Some guideline is there, sir, recently, 2 months ago, something.
No, there is no rabies control. They've come up with the National Action Plan for Rabies Elimination. NCDC has come up with it. Yes. Okay. But those are all words on paper.
But if vaccine is cheap and we can include that in immunization program, but if government is doing some like
immunization for whom? For people or for dogs?
Adult immunization.
So the WHO and all these guys have said that that's too expensive and that's not a economically feasible strategy. They've modeled that vaccinating dogs might be a more economically feasible strategy. But there are arguments that say that in remote areas, you should actually include rabies vaccination for childhood because it removes the necessity for obtaining RIG. Because if you've been vaccinated once, you don't need RIG again in your life. Okay, that's it. In fact, it's contraindicated if you've received had a vaccine. So these guys, basically the point of this exercise, and it's an interesting story, and I could spend hours talking about this, is that ecology can inform mitigation, can first inform discovery of the dynamics of disease, but can then also inform mitigation strategies. Okay? So that's the sort of message I want you to take away from this, because there's lots of other strategies also. For example, Mission Rabies, which is an NGO based in the UK, deploys these two kinds of strategies. In Africa, where all dogs are owned, people bring them and stand in line nicely and get free vaccines. Okay, but in India, where we have a large free-roaming dog population, especially in rural and urban areas, you have to spend a lot of time and effort catching them to vaccinate them. And it's a huge amount of effort required, lots of money.
So is India the only country in the world with free-ranging dogs?
It's not the only country, but it has the highest population of free-ranging dogs in the world. Yeah. And as long as you have free-ranging dogs, you will not eliminate rabies. There's a zero rabies by 2030 goal of the government, unless, as long as you have large populations of free-ranging dogs, you're not going to achieve that goal. This is something that the National Action Plan and all other rabies elimination plans tend to ignore. Okay.
So I'm just thinking, do we know how many dogs die per year or something because of rabies in India?
We don't.
Can we approximately say some number?
I think it's difficult to, because there's, so many causes of mortality. I would in fact say that, like I said, only 20% of pups survive till first year. So, 80% mortality is probably due to other causes. Rabies may not be such an important cause.
So I'm just thinking if we vaccinate all the dogs and we bring in herd immunity and the dogs' numbers rise a lot, then that is gonna bring its own problems with it, especially with like all this depredation on herbivores and.
Having millions of free-ranging dogs on the road is a public health problem from many perspectives, not just from rabies. In India, more than, just last year itself, about 70 or 80 kids or people were killed by dogs. The last few years, we've documented just from newspaper headlines around 400 people being directly killed by dogs, like direct attacks. Okay, in the last, I think, 6-7 years. Wildlife, already we know it's a huge problem. Dogs are the main major. Dogs are the second leading cause of road accidents. Okay, and this is data from the insurance regulator.
Also with wildlife and like diseases like canine distemper and all that, if rabies has been vaccinated for, then these diseases can increase.
Yes, so yes, from multiple different axes or different perspectives, it's not a good idea to have lots of unsupervised, unknown, free-ranging dogs in the streets. So that's, and I've written a lot about it. You can read some of my papers on this. This is one of my sort of big hammers I keep banging away at the nail on. So yeah, but I'll stop here with this story. So one story is fine, ecology is important to understand disease processes and how it can inform mitigation, okay? But we also have people in the mix. Remember I said people are interacting with these places that are they're realizing benefits from forest areas. So we can't say keep people away from natural areas. It's not possible. Because A, they are not the ones who've created the problem. It's people like us sitting in cities that are taking resources out of natural areas. Okay. So this is a project that Indo-UK project that I was really fortunate to be part of for a few years, and a second version of this project is also on the way. It's called India Zoo Risk. So basically, we looked at Kyasanur forest disease. Have you heard of Kyasanur forest disease? Aishwarya, you have heard of it. Okay, yeah, nice. Oh, wonderful. So this is a tick-borne disease, and there are lots of tick-borne diseases across in the world. So you saw that you remember those patterns of patterns of transfer of pathogens to animals and pathogens to humans. Sometimes it can also be by something called a vector. Okay, a vector is typically an invertebrate of some sort. Okay, which tends to take a blood meal from humans or for other reasons, not just that, but it typically tends to be an invertebrate. I mean, think mosquito, for instance. Okay, I'm sure Farah has already given her talk, or maybe not. You haven't? Okay. You'll hear about vectors. Farah is going to give a talk. Kavita is going to give a talk about vector-borne diseases. Okay, but basically a vector is a carrier. It's taking it from one source and putting it in another. Okay, so ticks are a vector for many different kinds of pathogens. Okay, and Kyasanur forest disease happens to be one of them. In the US, Lyme disease is a big problem. Okay, and it's a huge problem for hunters and people who go out into recreation. So Kyasanur forest disease was first reported from Shimoga district or not first, but in that area. And it's a fascinating case study. Okay, it's a fascinating case study in One Health investigation, not done now, done in the 50s and 60s. It brought together a team, a multidisciplinary team of people, okay, led by Dr. Rajgopalan, who then went on to become the first director of NIV, or the institute that was founded as a result of this. I mean, KFD is actually a landmark. The discovery of KFD and the disease itself is a landmark in Indian disease investigation in the history of infectious disease research in India, because it led to lots of important things happening. Okay? It was one of the first cases where there were people from the virology field, people who studied ticks, people who studied birds, international experts, funding from an international organization, the Rockefeller Foundation. All of those things came to investigate this. You've heard of Salim Ali, all of you, right? Salim Ali was part of the project that tried to investigate where KFD came from. And they suspected that it was similar to a disease, a virus found in Siberia. They thought the migratory birds were bringing it over. So they started a whole ringing program. BNHS's ringing study actually started there. Bird ringing study. It's fascinating. But it all started with the investigation of KFD. Okay. And KFDV is interesting from, it's got a very complex transmission history. What does that look like? So a whole bunch of different ticks can play an important role in the transmission of KFDV. Haemaphysalis spinigera is one of the most common tick species, but there are many other tick species also, as we are finding out. Huh? And at different stages of the tick's life, it feeds on different organisms. Okay, so the tick itself goes through these different phases. From an egg, it can go. The first stage is called a larvae. When it's at the larval stage, it usually feeds on small mammals like rodents or on small birds. Okay. Then, after it had after it's had its blood meal, it metamorphoses into its second phase, which is the nymph phase, and then that tends to either attack humans or other mammals such as monkeys. Now, if this, at some point of time, if this nymph or the larvae fed on an animal that was carrying KFDV, such as a rodent or a shrew, okay, or a bat or a bird, then it would pass it on to one of these other hosts. Okay, monkeys. Now, why is it called monkey fever? Also, it's also called monkey fever because monkeys are believed to be sentinel species. Okay. The common consensus was that monkeys are in fact the amplifying host. What does that mean, amplifying host? We talked about this bridging host, remember? So the story then was that they thought that monkeys were the amplifying host. That means they would develop high viremia. A lot of the virus was there in their blood and they would die. Okay. The hypothesis was then that partially fed ticks would leave the monkey's body and then go looking for a new host. And so that was designated as a hot zone. And what the health authorities would do was go and spread malathion or something else on in that area. Okay. So every time between November to March, you'll find dead monkeys due to KFDV in the forests of Shimoga or Uttara Kannada, Wayanad, up in now even in and Sindhudurg and Goa and so on. So a lot of questions still remain though. Is this the primary mechanism that people are getting it from? That means a person has to enter into this hot zone to then get one of those ticks which has co-fed or which is half-fed, and then the tick again comes and latches onto a human, and then the virus goes into the human. Okay, but there were cases coming from people who had not been into the forest also. So clearly there's a mismatch. So we didn't know. Picture abhi baki hai types. We didn't know but for years after those 1960 studies, people had stopped investigating because in India, we tend to do this. We tend to believe something is just gospel truth after the experts have talked about it. So even Professor Rajgopal, we spoke to him, he says, no, it became dogma with the health department. He's like, no, we have to investigate, continue these studies. Unfortunately, so finally we, a few years ago, we started doing some of these studies. Some of these results are now being published. But basically, we are finding that there might be, we are doing some more models, there might be, the co-feeding might be an important, co-feeding is when two ticks are feeding from the same wound, right next to each other. So they'll go bite, okay? And so then potentially you might have the virus from one of those ticks infecting the tick next to it, or getting into the body of the tick next to it, even though the host itself didn't have the virus, okay? What is the contribution of small mammals in the spread of the disease? We didn't know. We're finding out now that shrews might actually be very important. There's a whole host of other small mammals, rodents that are important. Okay. Bats also have been found, but I mean, a whole bunch of things carries KFDV. Okay. Livestock are not important though. Livestock don't carry KFDV, don't get high viremia from it. But they could be important from being adult tick hosts. Okay. So we did work on trying to understand livestock movement as well. So this is typically the landscape of the Western Ghats where you find KFDV. Nice paddy fields on one side. There's some plantation, areca nut plantation. There's forest in the background. So very nice mixed use landscape. Unlike what we saw in those stylized diagrams of, forest there, some agriculture, large areas of agriculture, and then some. No, everything is intermixed. You can't separate people from the wild. Okay, and there is no wild. Everything is there. Everything's everywhere. So you have to study everything. You have to study where the ticks are. And this is again where we used ecological sampling principles. Typically what would happen is, and this is why I think it's very important for sampling when you're looking at natural systems, follow ecological sampling principles. Okay? Which means that you don't go looking for something somewhere. You don't say, ticks are going to be on that bush, so I'm going to flag that bush to see if I can catch ticks. No, you sample the whole gradient. So you know which habitats are likely to be more tick bearing. Okay? So we did that. We sampled along many different habitats. As I told you, livestock are important as being potential tick amplifiers. Okay? So we put GPS collars on livestock. We looked at to see which habitats the livestock are going, and then when they come back, which ones have a lot more ticks compared to the others that are going into a different habitat. We looked at the small mammal community in all of these areas. Okay? And then, remember, people are also part of this equation. What behaviors do people exhibit that puts them at a greater risk of being bitten by a tick? That's something that we sort of seem to ignore in most of our, what is a risk-taking behavior? So we did this mixed sampling where we followed people, and one of our RAs, Mujib, was sort of the guinea pig. We asked them to go in the local villages, went and did. This guy would walk behind them in a very bright suit, and then we would check him for ticks. Okay, so which habitats were likely to have more ticks on them? So which habitats were more dangerous for exposure to ticks? And then you can accordingly tell people, avoid this, do that. What kinds of countermeasures can you take to prevent getting ticks? So then we came up with a whole host of we had these nice posters that we made in local languages to tell people to check for check their clothes. We gave the design for a simple tick removal tool. In case you found a tick you can make it from a plastic bottle. You just cut it out in a certain shape. So all these kinds of practical things can be designed. So these tools are important. All these, interdisciplinary tools are important because, what we found is that, if you look at natural systems, follow ecological sampling principles. Okay? So we put, we put GPS collars on livestock. We tested, we looked at to see which habitats the livestock are going. And then when they come back, which ones have a lot more ticks compared to the others that are going into a different habitat. We looked at the small mammal community in all of these areas. Okay? So in the absence of them, your focus often is on a single set of processes that drive the risk. It could be a social factor only, or it could be an ecological factor only, or some other factor, epidemiological factor. Okay? Only by thinking of them together, especially for complex diseases. These are not simple diseases, these are complex diseases. Okay? If there's multiple moving parts to this machinery, you need to take into account all of this stuff. And then use that to create a more informed model for why, of the disease risk itself. So then that incorporates your hazard and your exposure. Okay? That allows you to estimate the risk. So these are the kinds of questions we asked, and once we were able to get some of these data, we were able to then generate predictive models, okay, of where KFDV could strike. So we used, and I won't go into the details of too much of this. Ask me and I'll share the paper with you. But basically you can use models, you can use data from where KFD was previously found, and what are the biological or ecological factors associated with those areas, okay, including land use change, forest cover, livestock, and so on and so forth, okay, and the number of households there. And that allows you to then create a predictive map of where KFD is likely to occur. These kinds of predictive maps are quite common in ecological modeling and epidemiological modeling and so on. So you can, for example, this area, I will go to, we were able to predict KFD in advance of its emergence. This is in 2019, before the pandemic. Unfortunately, I won't say a controversial thing, so because it's on YouTube.
I'm just curious, how many samples were collected from
Aishwarya.
She asked how many samples were collected.
There were thousands of samples of ticks. Yeah, 6,000 tick samples were collected. Yeah. About 6,000. I think we had about a couple of hundred rodents, 200 plus rodents, or small mammals, not just rodents, shrews and rodents. We wanted to also do a study on monkeys and stuff, but we just never, either because of problems with Forest Department permission or all the other stuff, we just said, okay, it's enough work to do. So, yeah.
So I just wanted to say that we're hoping to hear from Rory on, I think it's Wednesday, about these ideas of risk. So this is a different approach to predicting risk based on ecological models, like you said, but this is what is very useful, right? Because then you can actually not just, the difference between making a statement like, oh, there's KFD there, which is very alarmist, versus saying that certain parts of the region may have higher risk, and it's a different thing to translate that into dialogue with community, but at least there's some map to go by for policymakers and stuff. This is very, very useful.
Yeah, absolutely. And
shall I have first slide?
yeah,
First slide. Okay.
this one?
No. Very first one. Yeah, this one.
This one?
Here, since 1957, still that disease existed, endemic to that region.
Yeah.
Slowly it is spreading.
Yeah.
So here, how do you correlate? Because I am not from ecological background, I wanted to understand what pattern of ecological, regarding ecology and all those things, interactions, so many things. So where the disease is spreading very slowly, very, very slowly, that we cannot understand why it is very slow. Still it is spreading. And one more thing, that the disease, suddenly it emerged, where there is no history at all. It is unpredictable. So that is happening in that region. I was also conducted field work just because of curiosity and I have project on that. So we are working on KFD. So which made me, it is very difficult to understand how bad, if we think bad, there is no fast spreading. If we think rodents, how rodents can move from that place to such a vast area. So it is very complex to think, not even understanding. It is very difficult to think. What are the, no, because you are from ecology background.
That is why ecological
Yeah.
sampling helps, because
Yeah. So, there's a couple of things here. It's an important question, and this has been asked multiple times by, not just by us, but by many. 70 years. Yes. The question is this: any virus, is it going to be at such a low localized availability, or is it likely to be part of a broader ecosystem? And it's quite possible that this virus is there in different places in the small mammal community. It's there in Wayanad, it's there in Tamil Nadu, it's there in Maharashtra, along the Western Ghats. Okay? It may not be emerging into humans because of a range of factors. And we talked about some of those factors. Those pathways have not yet created the conditions that were ripe enough for that last link to be made to humans. Because and this is the biggest, and if one takeaway I can send you from this course, is that nobody does any work on wildlife. Arun might be one person here, but nobody does any work on wildlife in India. We know nothing about the diseases of wildlife. Okay? And even for animals, even domestic animals, there's a lot of focus on some diseases of agricultural importance. That means from animal husbandry perspective, because of economic importance. But generally, we don't know. We are not talking about surveillance. Okay, systematic surveillance, generalized systematic surveillance is absent. So we don't know if KFDV was already found here 50 years ago.
One more question. So when I picked up this disease, I gone through the literature since 1957.
Yes.
I got the information that only adults, where they go, where they have a chance to visit forest,
Yes.
at least to get the fuel, forest wood fuels. There are many reasons, even for grazing animals. So that is the reason why only adults getting infection. But recently, even this year, last month, one 7-year-old child died.
Yes, died from,
So it is unpredictable. Even previous 4 years, many children, there is no chance for them to visit the forest. So how can you link the spreading of the disease among the population?
So that's the thing. So now, in fact, that's in our study, we looked at all these risk factors. We said, what are people doing? We found people are bringing headloads of leaves back into the house as bedding or as fodder for their cattle. Now, those headloads often have ticks in them. Okay, your shrews that are living in your house have KFDV. So you don't no longer, that's the thing. There are some links that we are trying to figure out now to understand, properly understand the transmission patterns of this disease. The other thing is,
the 2014 outbreak in Wayanad, what really happened is we released 3,000 monkeys deep inside the forest.
Okay.
All of them came back and started dying. So we were investigating that 2000, we did more than 350 postmortem in monkeys. And first we reported KFD, then started the human cases, and 200 cases, then 15 mortality. So that is a trigger. Now it is sporadic in Wayanad. Every year we are getting 4 or 5 mortality, even though we are vaccinating people.
The vaccine itself is not very useful. So
Yeah, it's 40%.
yeah, they're working now on a new one, but so no, the NIV is doing some work on it.
Yeah, and plus we did the sequencing also.
Yeah.
We couldn't publish that, but it's because of some of the political issues. So we did sequencing. We found around 8% nucleotide difference from the original KFD isolate in 1955 isolate.
Yeah. So just the other thing, so land use change again. bringing all this back in, land use change actually is one of the main predictors of the spread. So what we're finding is that, for example, in Maharashtra, cashew plantations are where you find most KFD cases. Cashew plantations have expanded in the last 30, 40 years. So like we said, the virus might have been there already in the populations of the small mammal populations, monkeys or whatever it is. The rate of change or the different conditions aligning with, like, you say the stars have aligned and good luck has happened. Well, sometimes they've misaligned and, bad things are also happening. So things are changing, rapidly changing in many of these landscapes. And therefore, the question, when we think of the spread of a disease, is often we are only tracking the spread of human cases. We're not tracking the actual spread of those diseases or even the occurrence of that disease in those places. Because, for instance, human cases or antibodies to KFDV have been found in many other places in India. They've been found in Gujarat, they've been found in West Bengal, they've been found in Andaman Islands. People have probably got infected here and gone there. So, it's for us to really do investigations properly for these. Basically, you find what you're looking for. If you're not looking for it, you're not going to find it. We are not looking enough, and we're not looking in the correct way. So that's what we need to start doing more of. Yeah, I'm out of time, so I'll stop here now. I've blabbed enough. Thank you.